What happens when arrogance takes the window seat and dignity refuses to move, even at 30,000 feet in the air?
The cabin of the transatlantic flight buzzed with the usual pre-takeoff chatter. Luggage slid into overhead bins, flight attendants hurried through safety checks, and passengers settled into their leather recliners. But in first class, the atmosphere felt more like a stage, and one man had already claimed the spotlight. His name was Richard Caldwell, a billionaire tech mogul from Silicon Valley, the kind of man whose face had been plastered on magazine covers, whose speeches about innovation had filled conference halls, and whose arrogance arrived in a room 10 seconds before he did. He walked with the confidence of someone who thought the world belonged to him, because in his mind it already did. Richard slid into the window seat of row 1, adjusting his tailored navy suit and flashing his Rolex like a badge of superiority. Beside him, in the aisle seat, sat a woman, tall, poised, and unmistakably black. She wore a simple blouse and slacks. Her braided hair framed a calm, composed face. She wasn't flaunting wealth. She wasn't demanding attention. But her quiet dignity made her presence impossible to ignore. Richard noticed, and almost immediately the smirk appeared. He leaned across the aisle to a younger executive traveling with him, his protégé, and muttered just loud enough to carry. His words were in Arabic, an affectation he'd picked up during years of expanding his business in the Middle East. He enjoyed tossing around phrases in foreign languages, not out of respect for them, but as weapons, private jokes in public spaces. "Abda," he whispered with a cruel grin. "Slave." The young man chuckled nervously, glancing at the woman, then back at Richard. Encouraged, he added another one. "Khadim," servant. The words were sharp, poisonous, and meant to cut unseen. The woman did not move. She turned a page in her book, her expression serene. To anyone watching, it looked as though she didn't hear, didn't understand. But Richard wasn't done. He thrived on performance, on humiliating others to feed his ego. He waved off the flight attendant offering champagne, his voice booming now, switching to English so everyone nearby could hear. "First class isn't for just anyone. Money buys comfort, not charity seats." The sentence landed like a slap across the cabin. A few passengers froze up, glancing at their tablets. A couple shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. But no one spoke. Who challenges a billionaire? Who risks the wrath of a man whose name opens doors? Richard leaned back smugly, convinced of his dominance. He carried himself like a king, and in his mind this woman beside him was no more than a shadow taking up space in his row. Still, she didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her fingers calmly slid across the paper of her book, as though his insults were nothing more than turbulence outside the window. But it wasn't ignorance, it was patience. Because what Richard didn't know was that this woman had lived in Dubai for years. She studied there, worked there, negotiated deals there. Arabic wasn't a code he could hide behind. It was a language she spoke fluently. Every cruel syllable he dropped, she caught. Every smirk, every whispered insult, every poisonous word, it all landed, not like a dagger in her chest, but like fuel in her fire. Passengers nearby whispered softly. Some asked each other, "Does she even understand what he's saying?" Others shook their heads, assuming her silence meant ignorance. But her silence was not weakness, it was strategy. Because Richard Caldwell, billionaire tech tycoon, didn't realize the trap he'd built for himself. He thought his words had cut her down. In truth, he had given her the perfect weapon. And the moment she chose to unsheath it, the arrogance that filled the window seat would collapse like glass under pressure. For now, though, she let the storm build. Because arrogance may have taken the window seat, but dignity had not moved an inch.
The air inside the plane grew tense, almost electric. The flight had just reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt signs flickered off with a soft ding. Passengers shuffled in their seats, flight attendants rolled carts forward, and the hum of the engines filled the cabin. But none of that noise masked the drama unfolding in row 14. The American man, broad-shouldered, sandy blonde hair, with a smug grin stretching across his face, leaned into the aisle, still seething from his earlier confrontation. He had demanded that the black passenger, a young woman no older than 30, surrender her seat by the window. His reasoning wasn't need or comfort, it was pure arrogance. "I paid for this seat, I deserve the best," he spat earlier, dismissing her as though she were invisible. But the truth was clear to everyone who overheard. His fury had less to do with money and more to do with the color of her skin. Now, as flight attendants began their rounds, he doubled down, his voice growing louder. "You people always cause trouble," he sneered, his words dripping with venom. The young woman sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, refusing to flinch. Her calm demeanor only infuriated him more. Whispers rippled across the cabin. Some passengers glanced nervously, others shook their heads in silent disapproval. A mother with 2 children tried to distract them with a storybook, while a businessman raised his phone slightly, pretending to check his messages but angling the camera toward the commotion. The American's arrogance was on full display, and he didn't even realize he was performing for a captive audience. The young woman finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "This is my assigned seat," she said, her tone polite but firm. Her eyes met his, calm, unyielding, and filled with a quiet strength that made some of the bystanders sit up straighter. But the man only laughed, a harsh bark of mockery. "Assigned seat? Do you even belong here? Look around. This isn't your place. People like me built this country, and people like you should remember your place in it." His words cut through the air, sharp and cruel. Gasps echoed across the row. A flight attendant quickly approached, a young woman in a Navy uniform, her face tight with controlled professionalism. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. You're disturbing other passengers." But the man waved her off with a dismissive hand. "I don't care about their comfort, I care about mine, and I want her out of my seat." He jabbed a finger toward the black woman, his voice rising even higher. "Move her." The flight attendant's jaw tightened. "Sir, this is her seat. I have her boarding pass right here." She held up the small slip of paper, proof of the woman's rightful claim. "If you cannot remain calm, we will have no choice but to report this behavior to the captain." The American leaned back, scoffing. "Report me? For what? Telling the truth?" His laughter was ugly, laced with the confidence of someone who had never been held accountable. He took a sip from his drink, deliberately slow, as though daring anyone to challenge him. But the black woman's silence was not submission. She waited, measured, letting the weight of the moment gather like a storm. She had seen men like him before, loud, entitled, drunk on privilege, and she knew the most powerful answer wasn't to match his volume, but to deliver truth when he least expected it. When she finally spoke again, her words were deliberate. "The truth, sir," she said calmly, "is not always what comes out of your mouth. Sometimes the truth is what everyone else in this room can see with their own eyes." She gestured lightly around the cabin. Passengers stared back at the man, their eyes filled with disdain. The tide of opinion had turned, and he was no longer the dominant voice, he was the spectacle. For a moment he faltered, realizing he wasn't as invincible as he thought. But arrogance is stubborn, and he doubled down again, louder, more vicious, as though volume could erase the humiliation seeping into his bones. But he was wrong. Nobody was laughing. Not anymore. The businessman with the phone had stopped pretending. He was recording openly now. A teenager 2 rows back muttered, "What a jerk," loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Even the mother with the children shook her head, whispering, "Don't ever grow up to act like that man." The passengers had made their judgment, and it wasn't in his favor. The flight attendant placed a hand on the black woman's shoulder gently, as if to reassure her. "Ma'am, you don't need to move. Please stay where you are. We'll handle this." But the woman smiled faintly, her composure unwavering, her eyes still locked on the man. And then, without raising her voice, without anger, she spoke a line that pierced through every ounce of arrogance he carried. A line that reminded everyone in the cabin that dignity, once unleashed, is louder than any insult. She leaned slightly toward him and said, clear enough for everyone to hear, "Respect isn't something you can buy with money or steal with hatred. It's earned. And today you've earned nothing but shame." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The cabin fell silent. The American man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his bravado cracking. His face flushed red, and for the first time since the flight began, he had no clever retort, no mocking laugh, only silence. And in that silence, power shifted. The young woman, still seated by her window, had turned the humiliation back on him.
The tension lingered like a storm cloud, thick and unshakable. The American man sat rigid in his seat, his arrogance deflated but not entirely gone. He shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight, his hands fidgeting with the tray table as if searching for something, anything that could restore the power he had lost. But nothing came. The black woman, on the other hand, radiated calm. She turned back toward her window, the light of the sun pouring across her face as though rewarding her quiet strength. She didn't need applause, and she didn't need validation. Her dignity was intact, and that was victory enough. The passengers, however, couldn't stay silent. A voice from the back broke the heavy air. "She's right," an older man said firmly. "Respect is earned." Others murmured in agreement, nodding, whispering to each other. The businessman finally lowered his phone, satisfied that he had captured enough evidence should the airline need it. The flight attendant returned, her posture more confident now. "Sir, we've documented your behavior. When we land, you will be escorted off this flight and spoken to by authorities. This kind of conduct will not be tolerated."
The man's face blanched. For the first time, he realized his actions carried consequences. He opened his mouth to protest, but quickly closed it again, the fight draining from his body. He turned away, slumping into his seat, staring blankly at the seatback screen as if hoping it would swallow him whole. The young woman finally allowed herself a small smile. Not out of cruelty, but out of relief. Relief that dignity had triumphed over arrogance, that she hadn't been silenced, and that others had witnessed the truth of the moment. As the hours passed and the plane began its descent, the cabin felt lighter, as though the air itself had been cleansed. Conversations picked up again. Children giggled, and the hum of normalcy returned. But one thing remained different. Passengers who had once been strangers now exchanged knowing glances, quietly united by the scene they had witnessed. When the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the gate, anticipation filled the cabin. The flight attendant's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated while local authorities board the aircraft." Two officers stepped inside moments later, their presence calm but commanding. They walked straight to row 14. "Sir, you'll need to come with us," one said firmly. The American man's face was pale, his arrogance replaced by dread. He stood slowly, his once proud shoulders now slumped, his eyes refusing to meet the gaze of the woman he had tormented. Passengers watched in silence as he was escorted down the aisle, each step echoing like the final toll of a bell. And then he was gone. The black woman remained seated, her expression serene. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't lashed out, she had simply spoken truth, and in doing so reminded everyone on that plane of a lesson they would not forget. Dignity doesn't shout, it endures, and arrogance, no matter how loud, always collapses in silence.